Elias Thorne was a restorer of rare books, a man who dealt in the scent of old leather and the weight of forgotten history. His life was quiet until he received a heavy, rusted key in the mail, accompanied by a deed to a property he didn't know existed, Blackwood Manor, located in the fog-drenched valleys of northern England. The manor had belonged to his great-aunt, Agatha Thorne, a woman the family spoke of only in hushed, terrified whispers. They called her a seamstress, but she didn't sew clothes. She was rumored to sew things that should have stayed apart. When Elias arrived, the house loomed like a jagged tooth against the gray sky. It was wrapped in thick, black ivy that looked more like veins than vines. As he stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. Every hallway was lined with tall, slender mannequins, but they weren't made of plastic or wood. They were wrapped in yellowed linen, and their faces were stitched shut with silver thread. In the center of the grand foyer stood a massive Victorian-era sewing machine. It was made of blackened iron and bone. Elias found Agatha's journal on the mahogany desk. The first page read, "The world is a fabric, Elias, but the fabric is thinning. There are holes in the reality we walk upon, and through those holes, the unraveled are crawling in. I spent my life stitching the veil shut. Now, the needle is yours." That night, Elias heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a floorboard creaking or the wind howling. It was the sound of heavy scissors snipping rhythmically in the darkness of the upstairs hallway. Snip, snip, snip. He took a candle and climbed the stairs. At the end of the long corridor, he saw one of the mannequins. Its silver stitches had been cut. The linen wrappings were falling to the floor like dead skin. Something was standing inside the wrappings. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its limbs moved with the jerky motion of a puppet with cut strings. It turned toward Elias, and where its eyes should have been, there were only two jagged holes leaking thick, black smoke. "Elias," the creature rasped, its voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "The seamstress is dead. The seams are coming apart." The creature lunged, not with claws, but with long, needle-like fingers. Elias scrambled back, his candle blowing out, leaving him in a house that was no longer just a building, but a living, breathing shroud. The darkness of the hallway felt heavy, like a wet wool blanket pressed against Elias's face. He scrambled backward, his hands searching the floor until they struck the cold, iron base of a pedestal. The creature, the Unravelled, didn't walk. It drifted, its needle fingers clicking together in a terrifying, metallic rhythm. "You have her blood," the thing hissed, the black smoke from its eye sockets curling toward Elias. "But do you have her steel?" Elias's fingers closed around a small, cold object on the floor. It was the silver needle Agatha had mentioned in her journal. The moment his skin touched the metal, a jolt of ice-cold energy surged up his arm. The needle began to glow with a faint, moonlight blue luminescence. Suddenly, Elias saw the world differently. He didn't just see a dark hallway. He saw thousands of glowing, translucent threads vibrating in the air. These were the lees, the fibers of reality. Some were strong and golden, but others, especially around the creature, were frayed, gray, and snapping. "The stitch of binding," Elias whispered, the knowledge flowing into him from the needle like a ghost's memory. As the creature lunged, its elongated hand reaching for his throat, Elias didn't run. He swung the silver needle through the air. He wasn't stabbing the monster. He was sewing the air itself. With a frantic, practiced motion he didn't know he possessed, he looped a glowing blue thread around the creature's wrist and anchored it to the heavy oak floorboard. The Unravelled shrieked, a sound like a violin string snapping. It was jerked to a halt, its arm pinned to the floor by an invisible, glowing tether. "Let us in," the creature roared, its body beginning to vibrate violently. Elias fled down the stairs, his heart hammering. He reached the front door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't turn. He looked closer and gasped. The door hadn't been locked. It had been integrated. The wood of the door and the stone of the wall had been stitched together with thick, black cords of hair. The house was sealed. He retreated to the library, slamming the heavy doors behind him. He looked at his hands. The silver needle was now fused to his thumb and forefinger, drawing a tiny drop of blood that it seemed to drink. He opened Agatha's journal again, flipping the pages frantically. He found a sketch of the foyer's sewing machine, the Loom of Bone. The silver needle is only the tool, the text read. The loom is the heart. To save yourself, you must find the spool of souls hidden in the cellar. But beware, the cellar is where I kept the scraps. The things that were too broken to be mended and too angry to be destroyed. Just then, a loud thump echoed from the ceiling. Then another, and another. Elias looked up. The black ivy from outside was beginning to pierce through the plaster of the ceiling. It wasn't ivy. It was thread. Thousands of miles of black thread were pouring into the house, and he could hear the snipping of scissors coming from every single room. The stairs to the cellar didn't lead down to a basement. They led down into a throat. The walls were lined with damp, pulsating fabric that felt like living muscle. As Elias descended, the silver needle in his hand pulsed with a frantic, warning light. The air below was thick with the smell of wet earth and rusted iron. This was the cellar of scraps, the dumping ground for Agatha's mistakes, things that had been stitched together incorrectly and left to rot in the dark. In the center of the room, hanging from the ceiling by meat hooks and heavy twine, was the spool of souls. It was a massive cylinder of translucent, glowing silk. Inside the silk, Elias could see faint, swirling faces, the life force of the Thorne lineage. But between Elias and the spool stood a nightmare of anatomy, the Patchwork Man. The creature was 7 feet tall, composed of mismatched limbs from a dozen different sources. One arm was long and spindly like a spider's. The other was a heavy, bloated mass of muscle. Its face was a chaotic mosaic of different eyes and skin tones, all held together by thick black surgical thread that oozed a bitter, gray fluid. New skin, the Patchwork Man wheezed. Its mouth was a jagged horizontal tear across its chest. The seamstress promised a final stitch. The creature swung its massive arm, smashing a wooden crate near Elias's head. Elias rolled away, the silver needle glowing fiercely. He tried to use the stitch of binding, but the Patchwork Man was too chaotic. Its energy was a tangled knot that couldn't be easily tethered. You can't bind what's already broken, the creature roared, its spider-like arm reaching out to pin Elias against the damp wall. Elias realized he couldn't use the needle as a weapon. He had to use it as a surgical tool. He looked at the creature's chest, at the master seam that held the entire grotesque form together. It was a thick, pulsating cord of black energy. As the Patchwork Man closed in to crush him, Elias lunged forward. He didn't stab, he unzipped. He caught the end of the master seam with the eye of the silver needle and pulled with all his might. He began to run in a circle around the monster, unraveling the black cord. The creature let out a wet, gurgling scream as its limbs began to detach, the magic holding it together failing as the thread was pulled taut. With one final yank, the Patchwork Man collapsed into a heap of lifeless, mismatched parts. Elias didn't wait. He scrambled toward the spool of souls and grabbed it. The moment his hands touched the silk, he felt the collective memories of the Thorne family flood his brain. He saw the great unraveling, a tear in the sky that happened centuries ago, and the secret war his family had fought to keep reality from falling apart. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound from the shadows that was worse than the Patchwork Man. It was the sound of a woman's soft, mocking laughter. "Good boy, Elias," a voice whispered. "You found the thread. Now let's see if you can handle the needle." As Elias emerged from the cellar, clutching the glowing spool of souls, the stairs behind him dissolved into heaps of raw cotton. He found himself not in the foyer, but in a narrow, infinite hallway lined with thousands of mirrors. These weren't ordinary mirrors. The reflections didn't show the hallway. They showed different versions of Blackwood Manor. In one, the house was burning. In another, it was underwater. In a third, it was made entirely of human hair. "The reflections are the seams of reality, Elias," a voice echoed. Standing 10 feet away was a figure that made the Patchwork Man look like a toy. It was the Needlewoman. She wore a gown of tattered black silk that seemed to be made of shadows, and her fingers were actual silver needles, 12 inches long, fused to her knuckles. Her face was a porcelain mask, frozen in a serene smile, but behind the mask, Elias could see the frantic movement of 1,000 tiny spiders. "Agatha," Elias whispered, his grip tightening on the spool. "Agatha was weak," the needlewoman replied, her head tilting with a sickening crack. "She wanted to mend the world. I want to redesign it. Imagine a world where nothing is separate. No you, no me, no life, no death. Just one endless, beautiful stitch." She lunged. Her needle fingers pierced the air, leaving trails of black silk behind them. Elias dived into one of the mirrors. The glass didn't shatter. It rippled like water. He found himself inside the reflection, a version of the hallway where gravity was reversed. He looked back and saw the needlewoman reaching into the mirror after him. Her long, silver fingers tore through the surface of the glass, as if it were parchment. "You're running out of thread, Elias," she laughed. Elias realized the spool of souls was his only defense. He reached into the glowing silk and pulled out a strand of pure, golden light. He threaded it through his silver needle. As the needlewoman's hand burst through the mirror to seize him, Elias performed this stitch of the third eye. He didn't strike her. He struck the reflection of her heart in the mirror next to him. The effect was instantaneous. The needlewoman screamed as the golden thread bound her reflection, paralyzing her physical body in the hallway outside. "You're just a scrap," Elias shouted, his voice gaining a confidence he didn't know he had. "And I'm the one with the needle." He used the golden thread to sew the surface of the mirror shut, trapping the needlewoman inside the glass. Her porcelain mask finally shattered, revealing a face of raw, pulsating nerves before the glass turned opaque and silent. But the victory was short-lived. The golden thread began to turn black. The unraveling wasn't just coming from the monsters. It was coming from the house itself. The walls were beginning to fray, the wallpaper peeling back to reveal a void of absolute nothingness. Elias looked at the spool. It was shrinking. Every time he used the light to defend himself, he was using up the Thorne family's legacy. He needed to reach the Loom of Bone in the foyer. He needed to reweave the master seam of the world before the spool ran out in the house, and Elias with it simply ceased to exist. Elias burst through the library doors into the grand foyer, but the room had expanded into a cavernous cathedral of ribs and sinew. In the center sat the Loom of Bone, its giant wooden pedals thumping like a heartbeat. Standing at the controls was a silhouette that made Elias's stomach turn. It was his own shadow, detached from his feet and standing upright. The shadow Elias was taller, darker, and lacked the hesitation that defined Elias's movements. It was feeding the black ivy, the void thread, into the loom, weaving a massive, heavy shroud that pulsed with a cold, gravitational pull. "What are you doing?" Elias cried, the silver needle glowing white-hot in his hand. Completing the work, the shadow Elias replied, its voice a hollow echo of Elias's own. "Agatha spent her life fighting the darkness. I am embracing it. When this shroud is finished, the sun will be just another hole in the fabric, and we will finally be free of the light that judges us." As the shadow Elias pumped the petals, the house groaned. The ceiling began to unravel, revealing a sky not of stars, but of a vast, shifting gray fabric that was being pulled down by the loom. Elias lunged forward, but the shadow Elias moved with impossible speed. Because it was a shadow, it didn't move on the floor, it moved through the geometry of the room. It emerged from a corner and struck Elias with a lash of black silk, sending him sprawling across the bone-white floor. "You are weak because you are solid," the shadow sneered. "I'm the potential of everything you refuse to be." Elias looked at the spool of souls. It was nearly empty. There was only one strand of golden light left. If he used it to bind the shadow, he would have nothing left to fix the veil. If he didn't, the Shroud of Night would be completed in minutes. He looked at the Loom of Bone and realized something. The loom wasn't just a machine. It was a musical instrument. It required a rhythm. Elias stood up and closed his eyes. He stopped trying to fight the shadow and started listening to the heartbeat of the loom. Thump, 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 thump. He began to move in sync with the machine. As the shadow Elias lashed out again, Elias didn't dodge. He threaded himself through the attack, using the silver needle to catch the black silk and redirect it back into the gears of the loom. "What are you doing?" the shadow shrieked. "I'm changing the pattern," Elias said. He took the final golden strand from the spool and, instead of attacking the shadow, he thrust the needle into his own chest, not to kill himself, but to stitch his shadow back to his heels. Using this stitch of reunion, he dragged the shadow Elias screaming across the floor. The two forms collided, and for a moment, Elias felt the crushing weight of his own darkness. But the golden thread acted as a weld. The shadow was pinned back to his feet, its power now fueling Elias's own body. With a roar of redirected energy, Elias grabbed the handles of the loom. He didn't stop the machine. He reversed it. The shroud of night began to unspool, the black threads flying upward back into the void. But the reversal created a massive temporal backwash. The house began to shake as if in the grip of a hurricane. "Elias," a voice cried from the loom's gears. It was Agatha's spirit, trapped in the very machine she had built. "The master seam is located in the attic of lost hours. You must go there now. If you don't anchor the world there, the reversal will tear the Thorne bloodline out of time itself." The stairs to the attic were not made of wood, but of stacked clocks, their gears grinding and ticking in a discordant symphony. As Elias climbed, the air grew thin and tasted of dust and old memories. When he reached the top, the attic was infinite. It wasn't a room. It was a sprawling landscape of frozen moments. Thousands of translucent spheres floated in the air, each containing a memory from Elias's life. In one, he was 5 years old, crying over a broken toy. In another, he was a lonely teenager, hiding in the back of a library. "Welcome to the workshop of the universe, Elias," a voice boomed, vibrating through the very floorboards. From the shadows emerged the Thimble-King. He was a titan made of rusted iron and jagged obsidian, his body draped in a cape of stolen stars. His head was a massive, silver thimble, and his eyes were glowing red embers that burned with the heat of a dying sun. "I'm the one who rips," the king declared. "Agatha spent decades mending what I tore for sport. Now, I shall tear the boy who thinks he can sew the sky." The Thimble-King raised a hand, and the frozen moments began to shatter. As each sphere broke, the memory inside vanished. Elias felt his own mind fraying. He forgot the name of his first pet, the smell of his mother's perfume, the sound of his own laughter. "You're erasing me," Elias screamed, the silver needle in his hand flickering as his identity weakened. "I am unmaking you," the king corrected. "To repair the veil, you need a soul. But what is a soul once I have removed the memories that gave it shape?" Elias realized he couldn't fight the king with strength. He had to use the stitch of remembrance. He grabbed the last remaining golden thread from the spool of souls, a thread that was now as thin as a spider silk. Instead of attacking the king, Elias dove into the floating spheres. He began to weave them together. He stitched the memory of his first heartbreak to the memory of his first success. He tied his grief to his courage. He wasn't just saving his memories. He was creating a mnemonic web. The Thimble-King roared, striking at the web with his obsidian claws, but the web was flexible. It didn't break, it absorbed the blow. The more the king tried to tear it, the more the memories reinforced each other. "Memory isn't just a record," Elias shouted, his voice regaining its strength. "It's the anchor of reality." Elias flung the web over the Thimble-King. The glowing threads of his life wrapped around the Iron Titan, pulling him down. The king's rusted body began to crack as the weight of Elias's lived experience. The joy, the pain, and the mundane crushed the void entity. As the king collapsed, he left behind a single, glowing point of light in the center of the attic, the needle eye of reality. The anchor, Elias breathed, but as he approached the light, he saw that the needle eye was closing. The temporal backwash from the loom below was pulling the attic apart. If he didn't thread the veil through the eye now, the manor and everyone inside would be erased from the timeline. However, there was a catch. To thread the eye, Elias had to use his own heartbeat as the final spool. The attic of lost hours began to dissolve. The walls of clocks shattered, their springs and cogs flying into the air like metallic shrapnel. The only thing left standing in the center of the void was the needle eye of reality, a tiny, blindingly bright aperture that flickered like a dying candle. "It's not enough," a voice echoed through the room. Elias turned and saw a shimmering, translucent figure emerging from the floorboards. It was Agatha Thorne. She didn't look like the old woman from the photographs. She was a being of pure, woven light, her body a complex tapestry of glowing lines. "Aunt Agatha." Elias reached out, but his hand passed through her. "The spool is empty, Elias," she said, her voice sounding like the rustle of silk. "To bridge the gap between what is real and what is void, you need a thread that never ends. You need a thread that generates its own heat." She pointed to his chest. "The Thorne lineage has always been the thread. I didn't die, Elias. I ran out of physical space. I had to weave myself into the foundations of Blackwood Manor to keep the walls from collapsing. I am a house, and now the house is failing." The Thimble-King, though crushed by the mnemonic web, was not dead. His iron heart began to pulse with a dark, gravitational pull, trying to swallow the needle eye. "If the eye closes," Agatha warned, "the Unravelled will not just enter this world. They will become this world." Elias looked at the silver needle fused to his hand. He understood now. The needle wasn't just a tool, it was a conduit. He stepped toward the flickering light of the eye. "How do I do it?" he asked. "You must perform the stitch of the living pulse," Agatha whispered, her image beginning to fade. "You must thread your own heartbeat through the eye. It will anchor the world, but you will no longer be a man of flesh and bone. You will be the seamstress. You will be the guardian of the veil." Elias thought of his quiet life, his books, and the sun on his face. Then he looked at the encroaching darkness of the Thimble-King and the screaming void beyond. He didn't hesitate. He took the silver needle and pressed the tip against the center of his chest, right over his pounding heart. He didn't feel pain. Instead, he felt a rhythmic, golden thread begin to pull from his very soul. Every beat of his heart produced a new inch of glowing, crimson gold silk. With a steady hand, he reached out and threaded this heart thread through the needle eye of reality. The moment the thread passed through the aperture, the house let out a roar of triumph. The golden silk lashed out, wrapping around the Thimble-King and pulling the iron titan into the eye, where he was compressed into nothingness. But the cost was immediate. Elias felt his body becoming light, his skin turning into the same yellowed linen as the mannequins in the hallway. His memories didn't vanish, but they became part of the architecture. He felt the cold stone of the cellar in his feet and the wind on the roof in his hair. "It is done." Agatha's voice drifted away. "The veil is mended. But the needle never rests, Elias. Never rest." Elias stood in the center of the attic, no longer a man, but a luminous figure of thread. He had saved the world, but he was now the prisoner of his own victory. Or so he thought. A sudden, sharp snip echoed through the attic. Elias looked down. A pair of rusted garden shears had appeared in the air, held by a pair of invisible hands. The shears were closing around his heart thread, the very thing keeping reality together. The sound of the snip was not just a noise. It was a physical shock that sent a tremor through the foundations of the universe. Elias, now a shimmering construct of golden thread, felt a sudden, agonizing weakness. His heart thread, the lifeline of reality, had been nicked. From the corners of the attic, where the shadows were darkest, the cutter emerged. If the Thimble-King was a titan of iron, the cutter was something far more terrifying, a presence of pure absence. It had no body, only a pair of massive, rusted garden shears that floated in the air, guided by two pale, elongated hands that seemed to have too many joints. "The Thorne family builds," a cold, metallic voice hissed from the void. "But I'm the entropy that demands it all fall apart. For every stitch you make, Elias, I will make a cut." The fabric must be shredded so the void can breathe. The shears lunged again. Elias moved, but he was no longer bound by human physics. He didn't run. He unspooled. He shifted his form into a stream of golden light, narrowly dodging the rusted blades. "You can't stay here, Elias," the spirit of the house, Agatha's fading echo, whispered. "In this realm, he can see your thread. You must take him into the shadow of the needle." Elias realized what he had to do. He reached out and grabbed the very air, finding a seam in the attic's reality. With a violent pull of his silver needle fingers, he tore open a rift and dove in, dragging the cutter and his floating shears with him. They landed in a place of gray silence. This was the shadow of the needle, a dimension where the scraps of history were discarded. It was a wasteland of half-finished thoughts, abandoned civilizations, and people who had been unraveled from time. In this gray world, the cutter was at its strongest. Thousands of rusted scissors littered the ground like fallen leaves. "Here, there's nothing to save," the cutter mocked. The hands gripped the shears, and with a sudden snap, they sent a wave of antimatter shears flying toward Elias. Elias stood his ground. He didn't use his thread to build. He used it to absorb. He realized that the scraps around him weren't just trash, they were raw material. He began to pull the discarded memories and lost histories of the wasteland toward him, weaving them into a massive, protective shield. "You call these scraps?" Elias's voice resonated like a cathedral bell. "These are the stories you try to kill, and they still have a pulse." Elias performed the stitch of the forgotten. He wove the gray history of the wasteland into a complex, multi-layered net. When the cutter's blade struck, they didn't cut through. They became tangled in the millions of tiny, forgotten lives that Elias had gathered. The cutter roared, a sound of grating metal. The shears began to rust even further, the life of the discarded memories clashing with the cutter's essence of death. "You're just a tool, cutter," Elias said, closing the distance. "And every tool has a pivot point." Elias lunged, his silver needle fingers glowing with the heat of 1,000 heartbeats. He didn't strike the hands. He struck the screw that held the two blades of the shears together. The screw shattered. The two rusted blades fell to the gray dust with a hollow clang. The pale hands withered into smoke, and the cutter vanished into the gray fog. But Elias was exhausted. His heart thread was fraying. He looked at his hands. The golden light was dimming. He had won the battle, but he was losing his connection to the world above. Suddenly, the gray fog parted, and Elias saw something he didn't expect. A silver door with his own name carved into it. Elias stepped through the silver door and was instantly blinded. The gray, heavy atmosphere of the wasteland vanished, replaced by a brightness so pure it felt like a physical weight. As his vision adjusted, he realized he was standing in a perfect, white replica of Blackwood Manor's library. But there was no oak, no leather, and no dust. The shelves were filled with thousands of books made of translucent glass. The walls were white silk, and the floor was a single sheet of polished pearl. "So, the seamstress has finally sent a worthy successor," a voice said. At the far end of the room sat a figure known as the Grand Architect. He didn't look like a god. He looked like an old tailor, wearing a simple white apron over a suit made of woven sunlight. In his hands, he held a pair of golden thimbles, and before him floated a miniature version of the entire universe, shimmering like a soap bubble. "You fought the king, the needlewoman, and the cutter," the architect said, his eyes like spinning galaxies. "But do you know why they exist?" "To destroy us," Elias said, his golden thread form flickering. "No," the architect smiled sadly. "They exist to test the tension. A fabric with no tension is just a pile of string. A world with no struggle has no shape. I created the Thorne family to be the resistance. But for a long time, the stitches have been sloppy. The world has become a mess of knots and tangles." The architect waved a hand, and the glass books on the shelves began to glow. "These are the unwritten, the versions of reality that were too broken to exist. I was prepared to take my shears and start over, to snip the thorn line and let the void reclaim the fabric." Elias felt a cold dread. And now, I see a man who wove his own soul into the gaps. A man who used scraps to defeat entropy. The architect stood up and approached Elias. But the test isn't over. To keep the world, you must give up the man. If you stay here, you can live in the unwritten, a perfect life where Agatha never suffered and you never lost your parents. A world with no holes. Elias looked at the glass books. He saw a version of himself in one of them, sitting in a sunny garden, drinking tea, his hands normal and warm. No silver needles, no heart thread, and the world I left behind. Elias asked, "It will continue to fray." The architect said simply, "Without a guardian, the cutter will eventually return. The holes will grow, but you will be happy." Elias looked at his glowing, translucent hands. He thought of the Patchwork Man and the forgotten lives in the gray wasteland. They were messy, painful, and broken, but they were real. "A perfect world is just a shroud," Elias said, his voice firm. "I don't want to live in a book that was never read. I'd rather be the thread that holds the broken pages together." The architect's smile widened. He reached out and touched Elias's forehead with a golden thimble. "Then go back, Elias Thorne. But know this, once you return, the human Elias is dead. You will be the Grand Weaver. You will see every tear in the world, and you will feel every pull of the needle." The white library began to vibrate. The silk walls tore open, and Elias felt himself being sucked back through the layers of reality, his heart thread glowing with a sudden, violent intensity. The return to the physical world was not a fall, but a collision. Elias hit the floor of the foyer, but he didn't feel the impact. He was no longer a man of bone and gravity. He was a living web of light. Blackwood Manor was silent. The Unravelled were gone, and the darkness of the Thimble-King had been bleached away. But the house was still wounded. The walls were weeping gray dust, and the sky visible through the roof was a jagged, raw tear of static. "The final stitch," Elias whispered. His voice was no longer his own. It was the sound of 1,000 needles moving in unison. He walked to the Loom of Bone. He didn't sit at the controls. He merged with them. His golden heart thread wound itself into the gears, and his silver needle fingers gripped the main spindles. He wasn't just mending the house. He was rewriting the contract between the manor and the world. Using this stitch of the watchtower, Elias began to pull. He pulled the shadows from the corners and wove them into iron bars. He took the memories from the attic and turned them into protective glass for the windows. He took his own physical body, the last remnants of his human skin and blood, and fed it into the machine. Outside, the villagers of the valley watched in awe as Blackwood Manor began to transform. The black ivy turned to shimmering silver. The jagged roof smoothed out into a perfect, impenetrable peak. The house didn't just stand there. It pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, the heartbeat of Elias Thorne. With one final, massive effort, Elias threw the silver needle into the center of the foyer floor. The house let out a sound of absolute completion. The snip of the cutter and the tear of the king were silenced forever. Blackwood Manor was no longer a house. It was the anchor of the vale. Elias felt his consciousness expand. He could see the entire valley. He could see a girl 3 miles away crying over a lost doll, and he reached out a tiny, invisible thread of light to mend the toy seam. He could see a storm brewing in the Atlantic that threatened to tear a hole in the sky, and he prepared his needles to meet it. He was the Grand Weaver. In the library, the journal of Agatha Thorne lay open on the desk. A new page was being written, not by a pen, but by a golden thread appearing on the paper. The seams are tight. The veil is strong. To those who walk in the light, I am but a shadow in the window. To those who crawl from the dark, I am the needle that will sew your world shut. Elias Thorne was gone, but the weaver was eternal. High in the attic, the silver door remained, a silent reminder of the choice he had made. The world would never know his name, and they would never feel the holes that almost swallowed them. They would only feel the comfort of a reality that, for the first time in centuries, was finally whole.